The gunshot echoed across the desolate plains, startling a flock of crows into flight as Zachariah Calloway's bullet found its mark in the wooden post. Dust swirled around his boots, the setting sun casting long shadows across the Montana territory. It was 1876, and the promise of gold had drawn countless souls westward. But Zachariah wasn't chasing metal, he was running from ghosts. "You planning on wasting all your ammunition before we even reach town?" Clayton, his trail companion of 3 months, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. Zachariah holstered his Colt Peacemaker with practiced ease, his expression unchanging beneath the wide brim of his weather-beaten hat. Just keeping sharp. The two men had been riding together since Denver, an arrangement of convenience rather than friendship. Clayton was heading to the mining camps outside Silver Gulch. Zachariah was simply heading away from his past. "Well, save some for the road ahead. Word is Blackwater Pass ain't exactly welcoming to strangers these days," Clayton muttered, adjusting himself in the saddle of his Palomino. Zachariah nodded silently, mounting his dappled gray stallion. The horse, Storm, was perhaps the only living thing he truly trusted anymore. 5 years since the war, 3 years since losing his family to fever, and Zachariah had learned that attachment was a luxury he could no longer afford. They made camp as darkness fell, the Montana wilderness stretching endlessly around them. Clayton snored loudly by the fire while Zachariah stared into the flames, his weathered face revealing nothing of the turmoil within. 28 years old, and he felt ancient, hollowed out by loss and hardened by survival. Morning brought them to the outskirts of Silver Gulch, a town that had sprung up almost overnight when silver was discovered in the nearby mountains. Now it stood as a testament to human determination and greeted a collection of wooden structures, saloons, and brothels serving the miners and cowboys passing through. Clayton departed with a cursory nod toward the mining camps, leaving Zachariah alone as he guided Storm down the muddy main street. Eyes followed him, they always did. A stranger in a small town drew attention like blood in shark-infested waters. The Silver Dollar Saloon offered temporary refuge. Zachariah secured a room, stabled Storm, and found himself at the bar as evening approached, nursing a whiskey and observing the room's occupants through the mirror behind the bottles. That's when he saw her, a woman with chestnut hair pinned loosely at her nape, intelligent eyes surveying the room with the wariness of someone who had learned life's harsher lessons. She was playing piano in the corner, her fingers dancing across the keys with surprising grace for such a rough establishment. "Who's the pianist?" Zachariah asked the barkeep, his voice rusty from disuse. "That's Callie Zimmerman, Doc Zimmerman's daughter. Came out here after her father died back east. Runs the boarding house down the street now." The barkeep polished a glass with a dubious-looking rag. "Plays here 3 nights a week. Best damn music this side of the Mississippi." Zachariah nodded, turning his attention back to his drink. He wasn't here for entanglements. Tomorrow he'd restock supplies and continue westward. There was nothing for him in Silver Gulch. The next morning dawned clear and crisp. Zachariah ventured to the general store, purchasing ammunition, coffee, and dried goods. As he exited, arms laden with supplies, he collided with a figure hurrying down the boardwalk. "I beg your pardon," came a female voice, steady and clear. Zachariah looked down into the face of the piano player from the previous night. Up close, her eyes were the color of whiskey in sunlight. "My fault entirely, madam," he replied, tipping his hat awkwardly while trying not to drop his purchases. She smiled slightly, noticing his predicament. "You look like you could use an extra pair of hands, mister." "Calloway. Zachariah Calloway." The name felt strange on his tongue, as though he was speaking of someone else entirely. "Callie Zimmerman." She reached for one of the packages balancing precariously in his grip. "I run the boarding house just down the way." If you're staying in town for more than a night, you might find it more comfortable than that flea-ridden room above the saloon. Zachariah hesitated. He hadn't planned on staying, but something in her direct gaze made him reconsider. "Much obliged for the offer, Miss Zimmerman. I'll consider it." She nodded, handing back his package. Doors always open to respectable folk. Can't say the same for Johnny's establishment. She gestured toward the saloon. Something crashed loudly behind them, followed by angry shouts. Zachariah turned to see two men grappling on the boardwalk outside the saloon, a crowd quickly gathering. "McCullough brothers," Callie explained with resignation. "They've been at each other's throats since Thomas returned from fighting for the Union. Edward sided with the Confederacy, stayed home while Thomas enlisted. The war may be over out there, but it's still being fought in some hearts." Zachariah watched the scuffle with detached interest. He'd seen enough fighting to last several lifetimes. "You look like a man who's seen his share of battles," Callie observed quietly. Her perceptiveness was unsettling. "Most men my age have." "True enough." She adjusted her shawl around her shoulders. "But not all carry them the way you do, Mr. Calloway." Before he could respond, the town marshal broke up the fight, and Callie excused herself with a polite nod. Zachariah watched her retreating figure, wondering how she had read him so easily when he'd spent years perfecting his mask of indifference. That evening, a spring storm rolled in from the mountains. Lightning split the sky as Zachariah sat in the corner of the saloon, observing Callie at the piano. Her music seemed to quiet even the rowdiest patrons, creating an island of beauty in the rough sea of the frontier. When she finished her set, she surprised him by approaching his table. "Mr. Calloway, might I join you?" He stood, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "Please." She sat gracefully, arranging her modest blue dress. "I noticed you've not yet moved your things to the boarding house. I hope it wasn't my forwardness this morning that dissuaded you." "Not at all. I'm not accustomed to staying in one place for long." "A wanderer by nature or by circumstance?" she asked, her directness both refreshing and discomfiting. "Circumstance, I suppose." He signaled for 2 drinks. "And yourself?" Silver Gulch seems an unusual destination for a doctor's daughter. A flicker of something pain, perhaps, crossed her face before she composed herself. "My father believed in following opportunity. When he passed, I decided to honor his spirit of adventure." She accepted the whiskey he offered, taking a modest sip. "Besides, this town needed someone with medical knowledge. I'm no doctor, but I learned enough from my father to stitch wounds and set bones." "So you're the town's unofficial physician, as well as its proprietress and musician? A woman out here must wear many hats, Mr. Calloway. I suspect you understand something about adapting to survive." Their conversation was interrupted by commotion at the saloon's entrance. A group of trail-worn cowboys burst in, led by a bull of a man with a shock of red hair and an impressive mustache. "Sullivan's outfit," Callie murmured. "They drive cattle north to the railroad. Rough men, but they pay their debts and don't cause too much trouble unless provoked." The red-headed man spotted Callie and broke into a wide grin, making his way toward their table. "Miss Zimmerman, prettiest sight for sore eyes in the whole territory." "Mr. Sullivan," she acknowledged with a polite smile. "I trust your drive was successful?" "That it was, madam." His gaze shifted to Zachariah, instantly cooling. "Don't believe I've had the pleasure." "Zachariah Calloway," he offered, not rising from his seat. Sullivan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Passing through, perhaps." The tension between the men was palpable. Callie cleared her throat delicately. "Mr. Sullivan, I believe Johnny's been holding some mail for you behind the bar." The distraction worked. Sullivan tipped his hat to Callie and moved away, but not before giving Zachariah a final assessing look. "He's sweet on you," Zachariah observed once Sullivan was out of earshot. Callie sighed. "He's proposed 3 times in the past year. I've declined just as many times." "Not to your taste?" "Patrick Sullivan is a good man in his way, but—" She traced the rim of her glass thoughtfully. "He wants a wife who'll keep his home and bear his children." "Nothing wrong with that, but I've built something of my own here. I'm not eager to surrender my independence." Their conversation flowed easily after that, touching on books they'd read, places they'd seen. Zachariah found himself speaking more than he had in months, drawn out by her genuine interest and quick intellect. The storm outside intensified, rain lashing against the windows. When it came time for Callie to leave, Zachariah offered to escort her home. "That's very gentlemanly, Mr. Calloway, but unnecessary. My boarding house is just across the street." "All the same," he insisted, retrieving his hat and duster. They dashed through the downpour, arriving at her front porch drenched despite the short distance. Lamplight glowed warmly through the windows of the 2-story structure. "Well, Mr. Calloway," she said, wringing water from her skirts, "you've now seen my establishment. Perhaps you'd consider moving your things tomorrow? I promise the beds are free of vermin, and the coffee is considerably better than Johnny's swill." Standing in the rain-washed darkness, her face softly illuminated by the porch lamp, Callie Zimmerman looked like something from another world, a world of comfort and connection that Zachariah had long ago forsaken. "I'd be obliged," he found himself saying. She smiled, and something long dormant stirred within him. "Until tomorrow, then." The following day, Zachariah moved his sparse belongings to the boarding house. The room was simple but clean, with a real feather mattress and windows that actually opened to catch the breeze. It felt almost decadent after years of sleeping under stars or in decrepit saloon rooms. Over the next week, a routine developed. Zachariah helped with repairs around the boarding house, fixing loose boards on the porch, a leaky roof, a stubborn door that wouldn't close properly. Callie insisted on reducing his room rate in exchange, despite his protests. In the evenings, after she returned from the saloon, they often sat on the porch, sharing coffee or whiskey and conversation. Zachariah learned that Callie had come west 3 years ago, following her father's death from consumption. She'd used her inheritance to purchase the failing boarding house and transform it into a respectable establishment. "Most thought I was mad," she confided one evening. A single woman of 24, running a business in a mining town. She laughed softly. "Perhaps I was. But I couldn't bear the thought of being someone's poor relation back east, dependent on charity and expected to be grateful for scraps of attention." Zachariah understood independence all too well. "You've built something admirable here. And you, Mr. Calloway? What are you building with your wandering?" The question caught him off guard. "Not much, I reckon. Just moving forward. Running from something or toward something?" His silence answered for him. "I apologize," she said after a moment. "That was presumptuous of me." "No, it's a fair question." He gazed out at the darkened street. "I lost my wife and son to fever 3 years back, in Kansas. After that, staying put didn't make much sense." It was the first time he'd spoken of them aloud in over a year. The admission hung in the air between them. Callie didn't offer platitudes or expressions of pity, for which he was grateful. Instead, she simply said, "Thank you for telling me." As April turned to May, Silver Gulch began preparing for its annual Founders' Day celebration. The town buzzed with activity as decorations went up and plans were made for a dance in the town square. "You'll attend, won't you?" Callie asked Zachariah as they ate breakfast in the boarding house dining room one morning. He hadn't danced since before the war. "I'm not much for socializing. Just one dance," she coaxed, her eyes sparkling with rare mischief. It would do you good to remember there are pleasures still to be found in this world. Something in her expression made refusal impossible. One dance, he conceded. The day of the celebration arrived with perfect spring weather. The town square had been transformed with lanterns and bunting, a platform constructed for the musicians. Children ran about with sticky candy, women displayed their finest dresses, and men had polished their boots and trimmed their beards for the occasion. Zachariah felt conspicuous in his cleaned and pressed shirt, the one good waistcoat he still owned, and boots that hadn't been this shiny since he'd purchased them. He lingered at the edge of the gathering, watching families and couples, feeling simultaneously apart from and envious of their easy camaraderie. "You clean up rather nicely, Mr. Calloway." He turned to find Callie approaching, and for a moment words failed him. She wore a dress of deep green that complemented her chestnut hair, which for once was arranged in loose curls around her shoulders rather than its usual practical style. "Miss Zimmerman," he managed finally, "you look beautiful." A becoming flush colored her cheeks. "Thank you. Shall we join the festivities?" The evening progressed pleasantly enough. Zachariah found himself introduced to townsfolk who had previously regarded him with suspicion. As Callie's friend, he was suddenly afforded a measure of acceptance. When the musicians struck up a waltz, Callie turned to him expectantly. "I believe you promised me a dance, Mr. Calloway." "So I did." He offered his arm, leading her to the makeshift dance floor. It had been years since he'd held a woman this way, his hand at her waist, hers resting lightly on his shoulder. He was surprised to find the steps coming back to him naturally. "You dance very well for a man who claims to avoid social gatherings," Callie observed, her eyes meeting his. "My mother insisted I learn. Said a gentleman should know how to waltz even if he never attends a ball." A wise woman. They moved together with unexpected ease, and Zachariah found himself relaxing into the moment. The soft pressure of her hand in his, the subtle scent of lavender that clung to her hair, the way her dress rustled with each turn, these small sensations grounded him in the present in a way he hadn't experienced in years. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For insisting I come tonight." "For?" He struggled to articulate what he meant. "For seeing something in me worth saving, I suppose." The music ended before she could respond. As they stood facing each other, something changed in the air between them, a recognition of possibility that hadn't been there before. The moment was shattered by a commotion at the edge of the square. Patrick Sullivan, clearly deep in his cups, was arguing loudly with one of the town councilmen. "Trouble?" Zachariah muttered, instinctively moving to place himself between Callie and the disturbance. Sullivan spotted them and changed course, weaving through the crowd in their direction. His face was flushed with alcohol and anger. "Miss Zimmerman," he slurred, ignoring Zachariah completely. "May I have the next dance?" "I think perhaps you should rest a while first, Mr. Sullivan," Callie suggested gently. "You seem rather fatigued from the evening's activities." Sullivan's expression darkened. "You'll dance with this drifter but not with me? After all I've done for this town for you." "Mr. Sullivan, you're causing a scene," she said firmly. "Please go clear your head. Not until you explain why you're throwing yourself at this nobody when I've offered you a respectable name and home." Zachariah stepped forward. "That's enough, Sullivan." The bigger man sneered. "Stay out of this. This is between me and the lady." "The lady has made her feelings clear," Zachariah replied evenly. "I suggest you respect her wishes." Sullivan lunged unexpectedly, his fist connecting with Zachariah's jaw. The blow sent him staggering backward, but years of hard living had taught him how to take a punch. He recovered quickly, blocking Sullivan's next swing and landing one of his own to the cattle driver's midsection. The crowd scattered as the men grappled. Sullivan had size and strength, but Zachariah had speed and sobriety on his side. They traded blows until the town marshal and several men intervened, pulling them apart. "That's enough," Marshal Davis bellowed. "Sullivan, sleep it off in the jail. Calloway, go cool down elsewhere." Sullivan was dragged away, still shouting threats and insults. Zachariah wiped blood from his split lip, aware of the spectacle they'd created. "I apologize," he said to Callie, who stood watching with a mixture of concern and something unreadable. "I've ruined your evening." "You've done nothing of the sort," she replied, taking his arm and leading him away from the curious onlookers. "Let's get that lip tended to." Back at the boarding house, Callie insisted on cleaning his wounds herself. They sat in the kitchen, a basin of water and clean cloths between them. Her touch was gentle as she dabbed at the cut on his lip and the bruise forming along his jaw. "You didn't have to defend my honor," she said, her voice soft in the quiet kitchen. "He was out of line." "Yes, but—" She set down the cloth, meeting his gaze directly. "I don't want to be the cause of violence in your life. You've seen enough of that." Zachariah caught her hand as she reached for him again. "Callie." It was the first time he'd used her given name. "You've been nothing but a source of peace in my life since I arrived here." Something shifted in her expression, a vulnerability he hadn't seen before. "And how long will you stay to enjoy that peace, Zachariah? Another week? A month? Until the restlessness drives you onward again?" The question hung between them, heavy with implication. He couldn't lie to her. "I don't know." She withdrew her hand gently. "I understand. Truly I do." She stood, gathering the basin and cloths. "Rest well, Mr. Calloway." The formal address stung more than his injuries. He watched her leave the kitchen, feeling as though something precious was slipping through his fingers. The next morning, Zachariah woke to find a note slipped under his door. Patrick Sullivan had gathered his men and departed for their ranch outside town. The marshal had released him with a warning, but the ranch foreman had intimated that Sullivan wasn't finished with the matter. Zachariah crumpled the note. He'd faced worse threats than a jealous cattle driver. Still, the situation troubled him. His presence was creating complications for Callie, who had built a respectable life here. Perhaps it was time to move on, as he always did. He found her in the garden behind the boarding house, tending to a small plot of vegetables and herbs. She looked up as he approached, her expression guarded. "Good morning," she said, rising and brushing soil from her apron. "How are your injuries?" "I've had worse." He gestured to the thriving plants. "You've done well here. My father believed in the healing properties of fresh air and growing things." She touched the leaves of a rosemary bush. "I try to keep something of him alive in how I live." Zachariah understood that sentiment all too well. "Callie, about last night—" "It's forgotten," she interrupted. "Mr. Sullivan has always been hot-headed, especially in his cups." "That's not what I meant." He removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "What you asked me about how long I'll stay. It's a fair question, and one I've been asking myself." She waited, neither encouraging nor discouraging him. "The truth is, I've been running for so long I'm not sure I remember how to stay put. But these past weeks—" He searched for words. "For the first time in years, I've felt something besides numbness. And that terrifies me almost as much as it gives me hope." Callie's expression softened. "What are you saying, Zachariah?" "I'm saying I don't want to leave. Not yet. Maybe not ever." The admission cost him something, exposed a vulnerability he'd protected fiercely. "But I need to know if my staying would be welcome. If I have reason to try building something here." She studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. "There are no guarantees in this life. We both know that too well. I can't promise that staying will heal what's broken in you." just as you can't promise never to feel the pull of the horizon again. That's not what I'm asking for. What are you asking for, then? A chance. He stepped closer. A reason to face each day that isn't just about surviving it. The garden fell silent except for the distant sounds of the town and the gentle rustling of leaves in the morning breeze. Callie's face revealed the internal struggle, hope warring with caution, desire with fear. I care for you, she said finally, more than I intended to. But I won't be something you abandon when memories become too sharp or restlessness returns. I wouldn't. Don't make promises you're not certain you can keep, she interrupted gently. Just show me day by day that you're choosing to stay. Actions speak truer than words, Zachariah. It wasn't the declaration he'd hoped for, but it was honest. And perhaps that was worth more than easy assurances. I'll show you, he agreed. The weeks that followed saw Zachariah putting down tentative roots in Silver Gulch. He took odd jobs around town, helping at the livery stable, assisting the blacksmith when extra hands were needed, even riding as a deputy when Marshal Davis required aid. The work was honest, the pay fair, and slowly the townsfolk began to accept him as one of their own. His evenings still belonged to Callie. They would sit on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and crimson. Sometimes they talked about their pasts carefully, tenderly, unveiling painful memories like fragile artifacts. Other times they simply existed in comfortable silence, finding solace in shared presence. Tension lingered, however, in the form of Patrick Sullivan. The cattle driver had returned to town a fortnight after the dance, sober but no less resentful. He made no direct threats but watched Zachariah with undisguised animosity whenever their paths crossed. He'll move past it, Callie assured him one evening as they strolled through town after her shift at the saloon. Patrick's pride is wounded, but he's not a truly vindictive man. Zachariah wasn't convinced but kept his concerns to himself. There was no point in worrying her unnecessarily. June brought scorching heat to the valley. The creek that ran near town dwindled to a trickle, and tempers flared as easily as the tinder dry grass. Marshal Davis doubled the fire watch, fearful that a single spark could devastate the wooden structures of Silver Gulch. It was on one such sweltering night that Zachariah woke to the sound of breaking glass. He was instantly alert, reaching for the revolver he kept beside his bed. Footsteps thundered down the hallway of the boarding house, followed by a woman's scream that froze his blood. Callie. He burst from his room to find the hallway filling with smoke. Flames licked up the staircase from the first floor, consuming the dry wood with frightening speed. Through the haze, he could make out several of the other boarders stumbling from their rooms in confusion. Fire! Everyone out the back way! He shouted, moving against the tide of fleeing residents toward Callie's room at the end of the hall. Her door was locked. He pounded on it, calling her name. When no answer came, he stepped back and drove his shoulder into the wood with all his strength. The door splintered, revealing a room thick with smoke. Callie lay unconscious near the window she had apparently been trying to open. Zachariah scooped her into his arms, burying her face against his chest to protect her from the worst of the smoke. The hallway was now a tunnel of flame, the back stairs their only escape. He navigated through the burning building, his lungs burning, vision blurring from the acrid smoke. When they finally burst through the back door into the relative safety of the garden, Zachariah gulped the fresh air gratefully. He laid Callie gently on the grass, checking for injuries. She was breathing, though shallowly, her face smudged with soot. Relief washed through him with such force it nearly brought him to his knees. The town's fire brigade had arrived, forming a bucket line from the well to the burning structure. It was clear, however, that the boarding house was lost. The flames had taken too firm a hold, the dry wood offering perfect fuel for the inferno. Callie stirred, coughing violently as she regained consciousness. Zachariah helped her sit up, supporting her shoulders. "Easy," he murmured. "Just breathe." Her eyes flew open, wild with panic. The others all out as far as I could tell. Jenkins was helping Mrs. Holloway, and I saw the Peterson brothers heading for the street. She turned to look at the building that had been her home and livelihood. The flames illuminated her face, reflecting in the tears that streamed down her cheeks. "Everything," she whispered. "Everything I built." Zachariah held her as she wept, offering what comfort he could in the face of such devastating loss. Around them, townspeople fought a losing battle against the fire, their shouts and the crash of collapsing timber creating a hellish chorus. Marshal Davis approached them, his face grim. "Miss Zimmerman, this was no accident. Saw broken bottles by the back door coal oil. Someone did this deliberate." Callie stared at him in shock. "Who would, Sullivan?" Zachariah's voice was cold with certainty. "He threatened as much last time he was in town." "We don't know that," the marshal cautioned. "Let's not jump to conclusions without evidence." But Zachariah had seen enough of human nature to recognize the work of a man consumed by jealousy and wounded pride. "Where is he now?" "Left town 2 days ago with his outfit. Heading north with a herd." The marshal frowned. "Now don't you go doing anything foolish, Calloway. If Sullivan's responsible, we'll handle this proper with evidence and the law." Zachariah nodded noncommittally, his attention returning to Callie. She looked small and vulnerable, watching her life's work burn to ashes. By morning, all that remained of the boarding house was a blackened skeleton of support beams and the stone foundation. The townspeople rallied around Callie, offering temporary accommodations and assistance. The banker suggested a loan to rebuild, and the general store owner offered credit until she could get back on her feet. Zachariah watched her accept their help with grace, marveling at her resilience in the face of catastrophe. Yet he could see the cracks in her composure, the tremble in her hands, the shadows beneath her eyes from a night without sleep. They stayed with the marshal's family, given a small spare room with a curtain for privacy. That evening, after their hosts had retired, Callie finally broke down. "What will I do now?" she whispered, sitting on the edge of the narrow bed. "Start over? Again? I'm not sure I have the strength." Zachariah knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "You won't do it alone. Not this time." She looked at him, really looked at him, searching his face for reassurance. "You could have died in that fire, trying to save me." "There was no trying about it. I did save you." He attempted a smile. "Though I admit it wasn't the most elegant rescue." A ghost of a smile touched her lips before fading. "I've lost everything, Zachariah. My home, my independence, my father's medical books and instruments, everything that made me who I am here." "No." He squeezed her hands gently. "The things that truly make you who you are, your courage, your kindness, your stubborn determination, those can't be taken by fire or by any man's malice." Tears welled in her eyes again. "I feel so cold inside, so empty." The words struck a chord within him. For years, he had carried that same coldness, that same emptiness, the aftermath of loss that seemed to hollow out the soul. "I know," he said softly. "I've been cold inside for so long I'd forgotten what warmth felt like. Until I met you." Callie's eyes widened slightly at his admission. "You asked me once what I was running from," he continued. "The truth is, I was running from feeling anything at all, because feeling meant remembering what I'd lost." He released one of her hands to gently brush a tear from her cheek. "But you changed that. You made me want to feel again, even knowing it might hurt." She leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm afraid, Zachariah, not just of what happened, but of what might happen. Of losing more than I can bear." I'm afraid too, he admitted. But I'm more afraid of walking away from what we might build together. The air between them seemed to still, charged with possibility and the weight of shared understanding. Callie reached out, her hand resting against his chest where his heart beat steady and strong. I'm cold inside, he whispered, echoing her earlier words. She met his gaze, something resolute replacing the uncertainty in her eyes. Then let my warmth melt you quietly, she murmured, leaning forward to press her lips gently against his. The kiss was tentative at first, a question rather than a demand. Zachariah answered by drawing her closer, one hand cradling the back of her neck, the other still holding hers as if it were the most precious thing in the world. When they finally drew apart, breathless and flushed, the coldness that had resided within him for so long seemed to have receded, replaced by a warmth he had thought forever beyond his reach. Stay with me, Callie whispered. Not just tonight, but always. Always, he promised, and for the first time in years, he meant it without reservation. The next day brought decisions to be made. The marshal had dispatched riders to locate Sullivan and bring him to justice, but Zachariah knew frontier justice could be slow and uncertain. More pressing was their immediate future. We could rebuild the boarding house, he suggested as they walked through the ruins, salvaging what little had survived the flames. Callie shook her head. It would take months, and more capital than I can access quickly. What about Sacramento? You mentioned your father had colleagues there. She considered this, turning a soot-stained silver frame containing a daguerreotype of her parents in her hands. Perhaps, or San Francisco. There's demand for medical care in growing cities. Then that's where we'll go. Zachariah took her free hand. Together. She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes for the first time since the fire. Together. They were married 3 days later in the small church on the edge of town. A simple ceremony attended by those who had come to care for them during their time in Silver Gulch. Callie wore a borrowed dress, Zachariah a clean shirt and his best waistcoat. Their vows were short but heartfelt, promises made by two people who understood both the fragility and the preciousness of life. As news came that Sullivan had been apprehended near the Montana-Idaho border, Zachariah and Callie Calloway loaded their few possessions onto a wagon and bid farewell to Silver Gulch. Storm and a sturdy mare purchased with their combined savings would pull them westward, toward California and a new beginning. The journey would be long and not without hardship, but as they drove away from the ashes of what had been, Zachariah felt something he hadn't experienced in years' hope. Not just for survival, but for a life worth living, with a woman whose strength and tenderness had thawed the ice around his heart. Are you ready? He asked as the town disappeared behind them. Callie squeezed his hand, her eyes fixed on the horizon ahead. As long as we're together, I'm ready for anything. And so they rode west, toward the setting sun, two souls who had found in each other not just companionship, but redemption, a chance to build something enduring from the fragments of their broken pasts. The road ahead was uncertain, but they faced it together, no longer cold inside but warmed by the quiet love that had blossomed in the unlikeliest of places, in the harshest of territories, between two hearts that had dared to hope again.